the sound that finally broke me wasn't a shout. It was a sigh. It was the sound of a man setting down his fork, pushing his plate away, the plate I had filled with shrimp and grits I'd spent an hour on, and delivering a verdict that had been written by someone else. The air in our small kitchen, thick with the scent of garlic and butter, suddenly felt thin and cold. The hum of the old refrigerator, a sound that had been the baseline of our life together for 4 years, seemed to grow louder, filling a space that had just been hollowed out by a handful of borrowed words. He didn't know I had packed a single suitcase before the sun came up that morning, a quiet act of rebellion against a judgment I hadn't even heard yet. He just thought he was winning an argument. My name is Opal. I am 29 years old, and for the last 7 years, I have been a high school art teacher in Savannah. Keith was 33. We had been together since I was 25. Long enough for the initial, vibrant colors of our relationship to have settled into a permanent part of my life's composition. As an art teacher, I spend my days explaining the principles of design: balance, contrast, emphasis, movement. I teach teenagers how to see the architecture beneath the surface of things, to understand that a beautiful painting isn't an accident. It's a series of deliberate choices. There is a foundation, a sketch, layers of color built one on top of the other, each one affecting the next. Love, I thought, was like that. You build it with intention. You choose your palette, you prepare your canvas, and you commit to the patient work of bringing an image to life, even when it's messy, even when you have to paint over your mistakes. I believed our life was a canvas we were working on together. It took me 4 years to realize I was the only one holding a brush. Keith was just the critic, standing behind my shoulder, telling me I was using the wrong shade of blue. The argument had been simmering all evening, a low heat under a pot about to boil over. It was about something small, as it always was. I had forgotten to pick up his favorite coffee creamer on my way home from school. It was the end of the semester, a week of frantic students trying to finish their final projects, the air in my classroom thick with the smell of clay dust and turpentine. My mind was a gallery of 100 tiny emergencies, a kiln that wouldn't reach temperature, a student whose portrait looked more like a monster, the endless stacks of canvases that needed to be graded. The coffee creamer hadn't even made it onto my mental to-do list. "It's just the one thing I asked for, Opal," Keith said, his voice laced with that familiar, weary disappointment. He wasn't yelling. He never yelled. He wielded his disappointment like a precision tool, designed to carve out little pieces of your confidence. "I know, I'm sorry. It was a crazy day. I can run out and get it now," I offered, already moving toward my purse. He held up a hand. "No, don't. It's fine. I'll just drink it black." He said it like a man making a noble sacrifice, as if drinking black coffee was a hardship on par with a natural disaster. I stood there watching him, and I felt the old exhaustion settle into my bones. It was the feeling of being perpetually graded, of always falling just short of an A. We ate dinner in a tense silence, the clinking of our silverware the only conversation. I had made his favorite, a dish his mother, Lorraine, had once famously declared almost as good as hers. It was the highest praise she had ever given me. After a few minutes of pushing the shrimp around his plate, he finally put his fork down. The sound was sharp, definitive. "You know," he said, looking at a spot on the wall just over my head, "it's not just the creamer. It's the little things. It's the constant feeling that you're not all the way here. I am here, Keith. I'm just tired. It's the end of the school year." "It's always something," he countered, finally meeting my eyes. His were flat, void of the warmth I used to search for. It's the school year, it's a student, it's grading papers. There's always a reason. I didn't have an answer for that because he was right. There was always a reason. My life was full of reasons. My career, my students, my own art. They were the foundational structure of who I was. He spoke of them like they were hobbies I should be setting aside for the more serious business of managing his comfort. He let the silence stretch, a tactic I knew well. He was waiting for me to fill it with apologies, with promises to do better. But that morning, something had shifted in me. Waking up in the pre-dawn quiet, watching the first pale light filter through the Spanish moss outside our window, I had felt a profound and unsettling stillness. It was the stillness of a finished painting, one you step back from and realize is complete, even if it's not what you intended to create. I had packed a bag then, not with a clear plan, but with a quiet instinct. I folded my jeans, my t-shirts, a few books. I didn't take any of the things he had given me. It felt like an act of separating colors on a palette, isolating my own pigment from his. When I didn't apologize, his face hardened. The disappointment curdled into something colder. "You know," he said again, leaning back in his chair, a judge about to deliver a sentence. "My mom was right about you. She said this would happen. She said you'd never be enough." There it was. The final brush stroke. Not his own, but one he had borrowed from his mother's palette. He said it with a strange kind of relief. The relief of a man who has finally found a way to articulate his own vague dissatisfaction by using someone else's sharper, crueler words. He didn't see the wound he had inflicted. He just saw a point scored. For him, it was the end of an argument. For me, it was the end of the painting. He had just named the piece for me, a portrait of a man I no longer recognize. And in the sudden, ringing silence of our kitchen, with the smell of the uneaten shrimp and grits growing cold, I felt the quiet click of a frame settling into place. The archaeology of our relationship began not with a grand betrayal, but with 1,000 tiny erosions. It was a slow, methodical sanding down of my edges, so subtle that I didn't notice the dust accumulating until I could barely recognize my own shape. In the beginning, Keith was my biggest champion. He'd come to the student art shows, praise my kids' messy, brilliant work, and tell everyone that his girlfriend was an artist. He loved the idea of me, an art teacher. It sounded creative, nurturing, romantic. It was a lovely aesthetic for his life. The reality, however, was less romantic. It was long hours, low pay, and emotional energy poured into other people's children. It was my hands being perpetually stained with paint and clay. It was me, at the kitchen table late at night, surrounded by stacks of student sketchbooks, trying to find something encouraging to say about a lopsided drawing of a horse. In that first year, he'd bring me a cup of tea while I worked. "Don't work too hard," he'd murmur, kissing the top of my head. By the second year, the tea stopped. Instead, he'd walk past the table and sigh. "Are you going to be much longer? The light from the kitchen is keeping me up." By the third year, it was outright annoyance. "Opal, can you please clear this stuff off? I can't even eat a bowl of cereal without getting glitter on it. It's a kitchen, not a studio." Each comment was a small act of displacement, a reminder that my work was an intrusion into his space, our space. But it was always his comfort that set the boundaries. I started grading papers in my car during my lunch break, or staying later at school, trying to keep the evidence of my professional life from spilling into our domestic one. I was curating my existence to be more convenient for him. Then there was Lorraine. She was a woman who seemed to be sculpted from disapproval. From our first meeting, she treated me like a poorly executed art project she was itching to correct. She moved through my home, the home I had decorated, the home where I paid half the rent, with the critical eye of a gallery owner about to reject a submission. She'd run a finger over a dusty bookshelf. "You girls with your careers," she'd say with a tight smile. "It's hard to find the time for everything, isn't it?" It was never a question. It was a statement of my failure. The kitchen was her primary theater of operations. She would help me cook, which was a euphemism for a complete tactical takeover. One Sunday, I was making my grandmother's recipe for red rice, a gula-geechee staple that tasted like my childhood. The air was fragrant with smoked sausage and tomatoes. Lorraine came to stand beside me, peering into the pot. "A little heavy on the paprika, don't you think, dear?" she said, not waiting for an answer before reaching into my spice cabinet. She pulled out her own preferred seasonings, which she apparently carried in her purse, and began to adjust the flavor. "There," she said, stirring with my spoon. "That's more balanced." Keith was sitting at the table, watching the whole exchange. He just smiled. "Mom's a wizard in the kitchen," he said, as if I had just received a valuable, free lesson. I stood in my own kitchen, a guest at my own stove, and felt the hot sting of humiliation. I had let her repaint my canvas right in front of me, and the man who was supposed to be my partner had handed her the brush. This was the echo pattern, a rhythm of critique that defined our lives. Lorraine would offer a criticism, and a few weeks later, Keith would repeat it, laundered through the filter of his own voice until he believed it was his original thought. Once, Lorraine had been visiting while I was trying to fix a wobbly leg on our dining table. I had my tools out, sawdust on my jeans. She watched me for a moment, her arms crossed. "You know," she said, "it's a shame Keith never learned to be handy. His father could fix anything. A man should be able to take care of his own house. It makes a woman feel secure." 2 weeks later, Keith and I were assembling a bookshelf from IKEA. I was deciphering the famously cryptic instructions while he struggled with a screw. He threw the Allen key down in frustration. "I hate this stuff," he grumbled. "My dad could build a house from scratch. I feel like less of a man not being able to do this. You shouldn't have to be doing this." It sounded like vulnerability, like an admission of insecurity. But hearing it then, I recognized the source. It wasn't his own feeling. It was his mother's definition of manhood, a definition he was failing to meet, and he was projecting the shame of it onto me. My competence had become an indictment of his lack. His birthdays were my annual final projects. For his 30th, 3 years ago, I threw him a surprise party. I spent weeks secretly coordinating with his friends, many of whom lived out of state. I booked a private room at his favorite brewery, designed the invitations myself, and ordered a custom cake shaped like a vintage record player. The most difficult part was managing Lorraine. She insisted on being involved, then criticized every choice I made. The brewery was too loud. The invitations were a little artsy-craftsy. The cake was probably dry. "She's just nervous," Keith had said when I told him his mother was driving me crazy. "She wants it to be perfect for me. We're on the same team, babe." On the night of the party, as his friends all yelled, "Surprise!" and the look of genuine shock and joy spread across his face, I felt a swell of pride. I had pulled it off. He hugged me tightly and whispered, "This is amazing. Thank you." For the rest of the night, he was the center of a swirling galaxy of friends, and I was a distant moon. He didn't seek me out, didn't pull me into a conversation, didn't catch my eye across the room to share a secret smile. At one point, I saw him talking to his mother. She was gesturing around the room, a look of strained tolerance on her face. Later, As we were cleaning up, Keith said, "Mom thought it was great. A little chaotic for her taste, but she was really impressed you did all this." I felt a familiar chill. He wasn't telling me he was impressed. He was reporting his mother's assessment of my performance. My effort had been submitted to the judge, and I had received a passing grade. It was a contaminated memory now. That moment of joy I felt when he'd first seen the surprise was retroactively poisoned. It wasn't a gift from me to him. It was a test I had temporarily passed. He raised his glass that night. "To Opal," he'd said to the room, "for making everything so easy." I had glowed, thinking he saw the effort behind the event. Now I hear it for what it was. A customer review, not a love letter. He wasn't praising my work. He was praising the fact that my work had erased itself, presenting him with a finished product that required nothing of him. The erosion wasn't just emotional and domestic. It was financial. My art teacher's salary was modest, but I was good with money. I budgeted, I saved. Keith worked in sales, and his income fluctuated. During his slow periods, I would pick up the slack. I never called it that. I would just buy the groceries, pay the internet bill, or cover a dinner out. "I've got this," I'd say. He never protested. He accepted it as the natural order of things. For over a year, I paid his portion of our car insurance because he'd had a small fender bender and his rates had gone up. He'd sigh and say, "I'll pay you back when I get that big commission." But the commission never seemed to come, and eventually we both just stopped mentioning it. I was the financial infrastructure of our life, the steady salary that allowed his ambitions to have a soft landing. But in his and his mother's eyes, I was the one with the flimsy, unstable hobby career. One afternoon, Lorraine was over for tea. She was talking about her neighbor's daughter. "She just made partner at her law firm," Lorraine announced, her eyes flicking to me. "It's so wonderful to see a young woman with a real, secure profession. They're buying a house on the Isle of Hope." I just smiled and sipped my tea. "That's wonderful for her," I said. "It is," Lorraine continued, pressing the point. "It gives a family such a strong foundation. Keith has so much potential, but he needs a partner who provides ballast." Ballast. I was a teacher. I shaped young minds. I gave kids a language to express their feelings when words failed them. I created a safe space for them to be vulnerable and weird and brilliant. But to her, I was just a liability, not enough ballast. I looked at Keith, hoping he would defend me, hoping he would say something about the value of my work, or at the very least, tell his mother it was a rude thing to say. He just took a long sip of his own tea and said, "More tea, Mom?" He didn't defend me. He refereed. He managed the situation, de-escalated the tension, but he did not protect me. He left me to absorb the blow alone. It was a quiet, profound betrayal, wrapped in the civilized ritual of afternoon tea. It was then I started to understand. I wasn't his partner. I was a project, a fixer-upper. And Lorraine was the head contractor, pointing out all the structural flaws, while Keith just nodded and held her clipboard. That night, after she left, I said to him, "What your mother said today was out of line." He sighed, the sound of a man burdened by the emotional complexities of the women in his life. "She doesn't mean it the way it sounds," he said. "She's from a different generation. She just wants to see us secure." "And you don't think we are?" I asked. "I just think you're being a little sensitive, Opal. She was trying to compliment her friend's daughter, not insult you. You're making it about you." And there it was. My reaction to the disrespect was the problem, not the disrespect itself. I was being sensitive. I was making it about me. It was a classic rhetorical trick, a way of turning the camera around to film the person who is pointing out the crime rather than the crime itself. I was being painted as the difficult one, the one who couldn't take a little constructive criticism. The final piece of the archaeological dig came a month before the end. I had won a small local award, Teacher of the Year for my school district. It wasn't a huge deal, but it meant something to me. It came with a small grant for my art department. There was a ceremony, a dry chicken dinner in a hotel ballroom. I asked Keith to come. "I don't know, babe," he said, looking at his calendar. "That's a Tuesday. I have that big client meeting in the morning. I'm going to be wiped." "It would mean a lot to me," I said, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. "I'll try," he said. "But don't be mad if I can't make it. You know how work is." He didn't make it. I sat at a table with the history teacher and the school principal, and I accepted my little plaque alone. When I got home, he was on the couch watching a basketball game. The plaque felt foolish and small in my hands. "Hey, you're back," he said, not taking his eyes off the screen. "How was it?" "It was fine," I said, setting the plaque on the kitchen counter. It made a quiet, plastic sound. "Did you win?" he asked, as if the outcome had been in question. "Yes, Keith, I won. That's why they hold the ceremony." "Oh, cool. Congrats." He finally looked over at me, a flicker of awareness in his eyes. "Hey, I'm sorry I couldn't be there. That client meeting was a beast. You get it." I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't try to paint over what I saw. I saw a man who had curated a life where his comfort and his priorities were the permanent, load-bearing walls, and my life was just decorative wallpaper he occasionally noticed was peeling. He didn't see my world as equally real, equally important. My triumphs were minor, my struggles inconvenient. And I realized my complicity in it all. I had been the silent partner in my own erasure. I had accepted the role of assistant, of support staff, of the quiet, competent infrastructure that made his life run smoothly. I had done it out of love, or what I thought was love. But love is not a service you provide. It's a space you build together. We hadn't built anything. I had been renovating a house that he was perfectly happy to live in, but had no intention of ever co-owning. So when he sat there in our kitchen, after my long day, after the meal I had cooked, and told me his mother was right, that I would never be enough, it wasn't a new revelation. It was just the first time the critique had been spoken in his own voice, without the buffer of his mother's presence. He had finally, fully absorbed her judgment and made it his own. The echo had become the source. And in that moment, he didn't feel like my partner or my antagonist. He just felt irrelevant. A figure in the background of a painting that was, finally, about me. The breaking point wasn't a loud shattering of glass. It was the quiet, internal click of a kiln reaching its perfect temperature. The moment when the clay transforms into something permanent, something that can no longer be reshaped. The clarity that settled over me in that kitchen wasn't angry. It was calm, cold, and absolute. It was the feeling of a blurry photograph snapping into sharp focus. For 4 years, I had been looking at a double exposure, trying to make sense of 2 overlapping images. The man I thought Keith was, and the man his mother told him to be. In that moment, the 2 images merged. They were one and the same. He was waiting for tears, for a fight, for me to defend myself. It's what I had always done. I would have argued my case, presented evidence of my enoughness, the birthdays planned, the bills paid, the support offered. I would have tried to make him see the composition of my love. But I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just a profound, hollowed-out stillness. It was the quiet that descends on a classroom after the final bell has rung and all the students have gone home. The mess is still there, the paint spills, the clay dust. But the chaotic energy is gone. All that's left is the work of cleaning up. "Okay," I said. Just that one word. It hung in the air between us, impossibly small and yet heavier than anything I had ever said to him. He blinked, confused. This was not in his script. "Okay? What does that mean? Okay?" I looked at him, at his handsome, familiar face, and I felt like I was looking at a stranger, or worse, a student's clumsy attempt at a portrait. The likeness was there, but the life, the soul, was missing. It was a flat, two-dimensional rendering. "It means you're right," I said, my voice even. I stood up and began to clear the table. My hands were steady. I picked up his plate, still half full of the grits he had rejected, and scraped it into the trash. The sound was wet and final. "So you agree?" he asked, a note of triumph in his voice. He thought he had won. He thought I was conceding. "You agree that you haven't been pulling your weight?" I paused, my back to him, and looked at the reflection of the kitchen in the dark window over the sink. I saw the room, the table, the back of his head, and I saw myself, a figure standing apart from it all. I was already outside the frame. "No," I said, turning to face him. I leaned against the counter, my arms crossed. It wasn't a defensive posture. It was one of stillness, of having arrived at a destination. "I agree that I will never be enough for you, or for your mother." I let the words settle. "I will never cook well enough, or earn enough, or be quiet enough, or want little enough. You are right. I am, and will always be, insufficiently small for the space you have cleared for me in your life." This was a mic drop line, a correction. I took his frame, "You'll never be enough," and replaced one implied word that changed everything. "You'll never be enough for you?" His face clouded over with confusion, then anger. "What the hell is that supposed to mean? You're twisting my words, Opal. You're being dramatic." "No," I said, and this felt like the truest thing I had said in years. "You're making this necessary." I didn't say another word. I finished clearing the table, washed the dishes, and wiped down the counters. He sat there watching me, a baffled, indignant expression on his face. He kept trying to reignite the argument, throwing out little sparks. "So that's it? You're just going to give me the silent treatment? This is so immature. My mom was just trying to help, you know. She sees your potential." I didn't respond. My silence wasn't a punishment. It was a boundary. It was a line I was drawing in charcoal around myself, a space he was no longer allowed to enter. My lack of engagement was a language he didn't speak. He needed a reaction, a canvas to splash his feelings onto. I was giving him a blank, primed wall. He eventually gave up, retreating to the living room to the comforting, predictable noise of the television. I went into our bedroom, closed the door, and looked at the single suitcase I had packed that morning. It was a small, navy blue roller bag, a weekend bag. It looked impossibly small to contain the end of a 4-year relationship, but I knew that everything essential was already inside it. The rest was just stuff. The quiet preparation for my departure had begun weeks before, though I hadn't named it as such. It was more of an unconscious gathering of myself. I had opened a separate bank account, a rainy day fund I told myself was for a new kiln for the school. I had started taking my most precious things to my classroom for safekeeping, my grandmother's jewelry, a box of old photographs, my personal sketchbooks. I was slowly, methodically moving the essential pieces of my life off the shared canvas and onto my own. That final week was a masterclass in dramatic irony. On the outside, I was performing the role of the dutiful girlfriend. On the inside, I was a logistician planning a complex extraction. While he talked about our summer vacation plans, I was mentally calculating how much it would cost to break our lease. While he complained about his boss, I was looking at apartments for rent in Jacksonville, where my sister, Chloe, lived. The day before he delivered his mother's verdict, he had come home with flowers. Yellow tulips. My favorite. "Just because," he said, wrapping his arms around me from behind as I stood at the sink. He buried his face in my hair. "I love our quiet nights," he murmured. I stood perfectly still, the stems of the tulips cold and slick in my hand. I could feel the tension in my shoulders, the effort it took not to flinch away from his touch. I knew he wasn't being malicious. He was just oblivious. He was tending to the garden, unaware that I had already salted the earth. He saw a quiet night. I saw the unbearable irony of a man trying to water a plant I had already uprooted. "What are you working on?" he asked 2 nights before, peering over my shoulder at my laptop. I was on a website for moving companies, getting quotes. I clicked the window shut. "Just some lesson plans for next year," I lied. The ease with which the lie came scared me, but it also emboldened me. I was creating a new composition in secret, and the secrecy was its own kind of power. Now, standing in the bedroom, the muffled sounds of the TV coming from the living room, I knew it was time. I didn't feel a rush of adrenaline. I felt a sense of profound, weary purpose. I changed out of my clothes and into a simple black dress. I took the suitcase from the closet. It was surprisingly light. I walked through the apartment one last time. It looked like a stage set after the play has ended. The furniture, the books, the art on the walls, it all looked like props. None of it felt like mine anymore. My apron was hanging on a hook by the kitchen door. It was a sturdy canvas apron, splattered with a Jackson Pollock of paint and clay and cooking stains. It was a map of my labor. I took it down, folded it neatly into a perfect square, and walked into the living room. Keith was asleep on the couch, his mouth slightly open, the remote control resting on his chest. The blue light of the television flickered across his face. He looked peaceful, innocent. For a second, a wave of something, pity maybe, or the ghost of affection, washed over me. But it receded just as quickly. Pity was a luxury I could no longer afford. It was a color that muddied all the others. Lorraine's favorite chair was an ugly, overstuffed armchair in a floral pattern that she had gifted us from her own basement. It was her throne when she visited. I walked over to it and placed the folded apron directly in the center of the seat cushion. It was a small, quiet gesture, but it felt like a manifesto. It was a symbol of everything I had done, everything I was now finished doing. It was a message for her, but it was also a promise to myself. I was no longer on duty. I picked up my purse and my keys from the entryway table. I opened the front door, stepped out into the humid Savannah night, and closed the door behind me without making a sound. The exit was not an explosion. It was a quiet exhalation, a breath I had been holding for 4 years. The drive from Savannah to Jacksonville on I-95 in the dead of night is a straight, dark ribbon of road. The world dissolves into the twin beams of your headlights and the red taillights of the occasional truck lumbering ahead. For the first hour, I drove in silence, the dawn-quiet stillness inside the car, a perfect match for the quiet in my own head. My mind, which had been a frantic storm of justifications and anxieties for months, was finally, blessedly calm. The brush strokes were already drying. I wasn't crying. I wasn't angry. I felt unburdened, as if I had been carrying a heavy, awkwardly shaped canvas for miles and had finally been given permission to set it down. The temperature of my emotions was cool, like the pre-dawn air. There was a sense of relief so profound it was almost physical. My shoulders, which I hadn't realized were perpetually tensed up to my ears, had dropped. My hands were loose on the steering wheel. As the sky began to lighten from black to a deep indigo, my phone, which had been silent on the passenger seat, lit up. It was Keith. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. A minute later, a text message appeared. "Where are you?" Another one, 30 seconds later. "Opal, answer me." Then a cascade. "This isn't funny. Did you go to your sister's? Are you at Chloe's? Your apron is on my mom's chair. What is that supposed to mean? Call me, now." The messages were a perfect portrait of his escalating panic. First, confusion. Then anger. Then accusation. He was cycling through the stages of a tantrum. I watched the screen light up with a kind of detached curiosity. It felt like watching a movie about two people I used to know. I pulled over at a rest stop just past the Georgia-Florida line. The sky was now a pale, soft gray, streaked with pink. The air smelled of damp earth and pine trees. I bought a cup of terrible, machine-brewed coffee and sat on a bench, watching the trucks roar by. My phone buzzed again. This time, the caller ID said, "Lorraine." I almost laughed. Of course. He had recruited his primary ally. I let it ring. I knew what she would say. She would be the voice of reason, the concerned matriarch. She would tell me I was overreacting, that Keith was a good man, that all relationships have their rough patches. She would tell me to come home and be sensible. Her concern was just another tool of control, another attempt to edit my composition. I decided to text Chloe. "Driving to you, left Keith. Need a place to stay for a bit." Her reply came back almost instantly. "Door's unlocked. Bed's made. I'll put the coffee on." That was it. No questions, no judgment, just acceptance. The simplicity of it, the unconditional support, was so powerful it almost brought tears to my eyes. That was what partnership looked like. Not a critique, but an open door. My phone rang again. It was Keith. This time I answered. I didn't know why. Maybe I felt I owed him a single sentence. "Opal, what the hell is going on? My mom is worried sick. You had us both scared." The us. There it was again. The two of them, a united front of concern. "Who is us, Keith?" I asked. My voice was calm, conversational. It was a simple, clarifying question. A question mic drop. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "What do you mean, who is us? Me and my mom. We're worried about you." "There is no us anymore, Keith," I said. "There's you, and there's your mom, and then there's me. I'm fine." "Fine? You pack a bag and disappear in the middle of the night and you're fine? You're acting crazy, Opal. This is manipulative." I took a sip of my bad coffee. It tasted like freedom. "I'm not being manipulative," I said. "I'm being clear. We are finished." "Because of a stupid argument? Because I said one thing you didn't like? You're throwing away 4 years over one sentence?" "I'm not throwing them away," I said, the words coming to me with sudden, sharp clarity. "I'm pricing them, and the cost has gotten too high." A redefinition mic drop. He saw it as waste. I saw it as an audit. I could hear his breathing, ragged and frustrated. He was losing control of the narrative, and it was making him desperate. "Look, just come home," he said, his voice shifting from anger to a strained attempt at negotiation. "We can talk about this. I'll talk to my mom. I'll tell her to back off a little." It was the offer of a compromise he would never have made when he had me. The promise of change only arrives when the leverage is gone. "It's too late for that, Keith," I said softly. And then his voice broke. The anger and negotiation failed, and all that was left was raw vulnerability. It wasn't love, I knew. It was fear. The fear of inconvenience, the fear of his life becoming harder. "But she was just trying to help you," he said, his voice cracking. "We both were. We just wanted you to be better." There it was, the last line he would ever say to me that mattered, the emotional peak of his escalation. "She was trying to help you. We both were." He had finally said the quiet part out loud. He didn't love me as I was. He loved the potential he and his mother saw in me, the raw material they could shape into someone more suitable, more convenient, more enough. He genuinely believed that their constant criticism was an act of love, an investment in my improvement. It was the most honest and most devastating thing he had ever said. I felt a wave of sadness for him then, not for the loss of our relationship, but for his own profound blindness. He had no language for love that wasn't transactional, no understanding of acceptance that wasn't conditional. "I know you thought you were helping," I said, and I meant it. "But some people don't need to be fixed, Keith. They just need to be seen." I paused. "Goodbye." I hung up the phone before he could reply. I turned it off, dropped it into my purse, and finished my coffee. The sun was fully up now, a brilliant orange ball painting the underside of the clouds. I got back in my car and merged onto the highway, heading south. I didn't look back. Arriving at Chloe's apartment in Jacksonville was like stepping into a different atmosphere. Her small home was filled with light, plants, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee. She met me at the door, took one look at my face, and simply opened her arms. I fell into her hug, and for the first time, I felt the tight, protective shell I had built around myself begin to crack. I didn't sob. A few quiet tears escaped, tears of exhaustion and release, not of heartbreak. "You good?" she asked, pulling back and studying my face. "I will be," I said. Chloe was a landscape architect. She understood structure, growth, and the importance of a healthy environment. She never said, "I told you so," though she had every right to. She had watched my light dim over the past 4 years, had listened patiently to my stories of Lorraine's critiques and Keith's casual dismissals. She had been the steady witness. The first few days were a blur of sleep and quiet. I sat on her balcony, reading, sketching in my notebook for the first time in months, just feeling the Florida sun on my skin. I was decompressing, letting the ambient pressure of Keith's and Lorraine's expectations slowly leak out of me. The vindication I felt wasn't a loud, triumphant thing. It was the quiet, gradual return of my own colors. My school district was understanding. I took a leave of absence for the remainder of the semester, citing family reasons. I used the time to recenter myself. Chloe helped me find a small studio apartment with huge windows and a view of a live oak tree. It was mine. Every decision, from the color of the paint on the walls, a warm, earthy terracotta, to the kind of coffee in the cabinet, was mine alone. That summer, I got a job teaching at a local arts camp for kids. It was chaotic and messy and joyful. I spent my days surrounded by the smell of tempera paint and sunscreen, helping children create lopsided clay monsters and vibrant, uninhibited finger paintings. They didn't care about balance or perspective. They just cared about the joy of creation. They reminded me of the reason I fell in love with art in the first place, not as a performance to be judged, but as a language to be spoken. In the evenings, I would go to my new apartment, which I had slowly turned into a working studio. The main room was dominated by a large easel. Canvases were stacked against the walls. The air smelled of turpentine and linseed oil and peace. It was the smell of my own life, my own work. I started painting again, not for a gallery, not for anyone else, but for myself. I painted large, abstract canvases full of bold, unapologetic color. I was finding my own composition again. Keith tried to reach out a few more times. He sent long, rambling emails that swung wildly between apology and accusation. He didn't understand what had happened. In his version of the story, I was the one who had been unreasonable, who had left without warning, who had thrown everything away. He couldn't see the long, slow erosion, the years of quiet disrespect. He could only see the final sudden crack. I never replied. There was nothing left to say. My departure was the only conversation we needed to have. One afternoon, about 6 months after I left, I was at a small art supply store near my apartment. As I was paying for a new set of brushes, I heard a familiar voice. Lorraine. She was at the counter next to mine, buying a set of watercolor paints. For a moment, I froze. My heart hammered in my chest. But then, a strange calm washed over me. She looked older, smaller than I remembered. There were lines of strain around her mouth. She didn't see me. I finished my transaction and walked out, my heart steady again. Seeing her didn't hurt. It was like looking at an old, preliminary sketch for a painting I had long since abandoned. It was a part of the process, but it had no bearing on the finished piece. The ultimate vindication wasn't that Keith was miserable without me, or that Lorraine had to face a life where she couldn't critique my cooking. I had no idea if they were miserable or not, and I found I didn't care. The vindication was the quiet, steady hum of my own life. It was the satisfaction of paying my own bills, of cooking a meal exactly the way I liked it, of leaving my art supplies all over the table for days on end without a single disapproving sigh. It was the sound of my own thoughts, clear and uninterrupted. Love is not an act of correction. It is not a project of improvement. It is an act of seeing. It is looking at a person in all their messy, imperfect, brilliant complexity and saying, "You, as you are. You are my favorite work of art." For years, I had allowed myself to be treated like an unfinished canvas, something that needed more work, better composition, a different palette. I was so busy trying to become the painting they wanted me to be that I forgot I was the artist. I was the one who held the brush. You learn eventually that some people will only ever see you as raw material for their own vision. They will try to sand your edges, mute your colors, and paint over the parts of you they don't understand. They will tell you it's for your own good, that they are helping you become a masterpiece. But a masterpiece is not something someone else makes of you. It is something you make of yourself. My life is my own studio now. It smells like turpentine and possibility. And I am painting whatever I want. If you enjoyed this story, please like, comment, and share this video with your friends. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a powerful story drop.